And the second I stepped foot into the workplace and did focus groups and would talk to employees, because that was my rule, I was like, I'm never going to take the executive's word for it. You can tell me what you think is going on, but I'm going to actually talk to your team and find out what's really happening. It always came down to a cultural thing.
Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
Hello, everybody. I'm Gina Patterson, your host, and I have Samantha Stilwell with me today. And here's why you need to listen to this episode. Sam is an expert in cross-cultural communication, and you're going to learn how to work with culturally diverse peers, customers, and business partners, and what the most common aha moments are when managers take her courses. We will also teach you a decision-making rubric for how to decide what to do next, especially important for multi-passionate people. And we're going to talk about her recent adventures with Air Inuit as a flight attendant, as a little extra snack for you today. So Samantha Stilwell is a cultural anthropologist. She's also the founder of Culture Dynamique, and she's an expert in global team management. Her skill set and training in cultural anthropology and organizational psychology have enabled her to transform teams across 4 continents in over 8 different industries. I also encourage you to check out her other tips on her TikTok at the Startup Anthropologist. Welcome, Samantha. Hello, Samantha Stilwell. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to be here, Gina. How are you?
I am excited to be here too. I'm doing wonderfully. I'm sitting in the attic of my friend's house because there is construction in my house. And I'm in Halifax. And are you in Montreal?
I am in Montreal. Yeah. And I'm staring out my snowy window, and it brings me great joy to know that I don't have to go outside today to deal with the snow.
I love that. We have not had any snow recently, and I kind of want some. And that makes me think about your new venture, which has to do with northern snowy climates. So I want to dive right in and ask you about it, because can you first tell us a little bit about your consulting company and a little bit about what you do? Because then I want to dive into the latest adventure, which you have just embarked upon, becoming a flight attendant for Air Inuit. So tell me a little bit about your work as an anthropologist.
Yeah, so I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I started my consulting firm to help people better understand their cultural identities and understand how different cultural identities can work well together. There's this common belief that in order to have, good collaboration, or this term belonging that we use a lot, that it means that everybody needs to think the same way, or everybody needs to work in the same way. It's a lot of organizations, unfortunately, end up going that route of kind of forced assimilation, even though that's not necessarily the term that they will use. Because it's just easier. If everybody thinks the same or has the same processes, whatever, we're more efficient, we're faster. And what we know is that your organization is really capped when it comes to performance if you're not leaning into these cultural identities, because there's so much variety that can be presented. There's so many, different perspectives or ways of doing things that could actually save you a lot of money, save you a lot of time. So yes, in the short term, you save time by just forcing everybody to be the same. In the long term, you cost your company a lot of money and a lot of resources. So I like to come in and help people. What I tell people is I'm kind of like a temperature adjuster, where I come in and I do very tiny little adjustments. Sometimes it's, as long as an hour conversation, and that's enough to start bringing in change. Other times it's a bit longer. But yeah, I help people to start getting a sense of who they actually are. So if we know ourselves first, it's easier to explain that to other people, and then start understanding how each of these individual cultural identities can actually work really seamlessly together to bring about greater success for everybody.
Okay, before we get into the other sort of career journeys you've explored, because I do want to get into that, because I think it's super interesting for folks to hear that there isn't just one career trajectory and that's going to stick forever, or that there's any type of step backs in career. But I want to just dive into that for a second. So when you're training people and working with people, I'm assuming that there are kind of aha moments that people have, especially, I want to say, white leaders who haven't necessarily had a lot of opportunity to examine our own ways of thinking, because we just think they're a little bit ubiquitous. But take that take the question however you want, Sam, but yeah, kind of like what are some of the common assumptions people are making, and what happens when they kind of realize what those are?
Yeah, definitely. So there's two ways that I want to go. So I'm going to try and like in my brain, I have these two different points that I'll click on. So I'll
Okay.
start with the simpler one, which is these aha moments are often not the ones that I anticipate they're going to be. Like I think it's going to be when I throw, some theory at them or some really interesting research, whatever, that people are going to go and say, wow, that's crazy. But like their brains don't even register that because they're still stuck on these little things that I've explained to them. Like an example is a Kenyan team that I had worked with at one point. Just being able to explain to them that they're very flexible when it comes to time. And so when somebody, when their manager who's in Toronto tells them that something is due at the end of the month, in their minds it was just like, well, the end of the month is kind of it's fluid. Like the end of what, like who's, whereas for us in Canada, like if somebody tells me it's the end of the month, that's January 31st. Like that, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And so it's just those interesting little
Hmm.
changes where, or like a yes and a no. Like we in Canada were very binary with how we give responses. And so if you ask me a question, I'll give you a yes or a no. Or you can safely assume that if I'm like, I'm not sure, that's it's probably closer to a no than a yes. But there are certain cultures where people have just felt like elated, or they're just kind of like, oh my gosh, this finally explains what I've been feeling, because there's certain cultures where binary answers just aren't a thing. And so
Hmm.
it's very normal for somebody to say, yeah, it's possible, but that's neither a yes or a no. And everybody's just okay with that nuance.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's often a lot of those aha moments are just where I go and say, things that I assume are pretty self-evident or that they've already come up against. And it turns out that just giving them those words or explaining it in a certain way suddenly makes them realize, oh, this is why I've experienced this.
Hmm.
The other thing that came up too is that because I have a TikTok channel, and I did not anticipate my content going in this direction, but there's a number of people from neurodivergent communities and neurodiverse communities who see my cultural training as like very applicable to how they also experience the world. And so while I don't dive into that world because I'm definitely not trained for it, and I'm not the best person to speak about it, it's been interesting in the comments to see people who have come up and said, oh, that actually, like, as somebody who has ADHD or somebody who has autism, or that actually explains a lot about what I've been feeling in my workplace or my friend group or whatever. So that's been a fun little gift as well, is to just know that it's reaching people, even when it's not necessarily related to cultural identities.
Is that because a lot of what you're doing is daylighting unwritten rules?
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
a lot of things we take for granted that I'm just kind of calling out and then putting words to, because otherwise they can quickly become stereotypes or the way that we explain them, right? We all use have different definitions for different words. So by being able to put a little bit more of a scientific term to it,
Hmm.
it removes a bit of the taboo, because it's like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me, or I'm not doing things wrong. I'm just time flexible. That doesn't mean I'm always late for meetings. It just means I'm flexible with time. So if you'd like me to show up differently, you need to let me know. So yeah, I think it puts things in perspective and it removes some of the personal side of things,
Hmm.
and instead just tells people, hey, this is the term for it.
Right.
Yeah.
So the way, if we were to explain how we normally work without this awareness, how would you explain that? Like, for example, would you say that the way we normally work is that we just think everyone is like us, and then
Yeah.
we make those assumptions, and then we manage people
Yeah.
the way as though they are us, and then what happens is they don't show up the way we show up, and so then we write them off. We're like, yeah,
Yeah.
you're not good at this job. Is that the right breakdown of what generally people do?
Yeah. So
I
many
did
of
that. I did that for a long time in my career.
We all do. Like I live and breathe this research, and I still find myself doing it. It could be with a friend, it could be with a family member, my partner who's from France. Like there are certain
Hmm.
moments where I'll get frustrated about something, and then he has to use my own words back to me to just be like, Sam, I think the issue that we're experiencing is this. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you're totally right.
I just did a workshop on that last week.
Not because you're a terrible partner, it's just because you're French. But yeah, so it's yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, I did HR consulting for a long time. I worked in HR for a long time. And as I was
Hmm.
transitioning to do fully the cultural diversity and cultural identity thing, I was still getting called to do HR work. And a lot of the mandates I got were for engagement problems and performance problems. And the second I stepped foot into the workplace and did focus groups and would talk to employees, because that was my rule, I was like, I'm never going to take the executive's word for it. You can tell me what you think is going on, but I'm going to actually talk to your team and find out what's really happening. It always came down to a cultural thing.
Wow.
where no, their performance is top notch. This Kenyan team was a perfect example. Like once we were able to solve those little things, all of a sudden overnight their performance skyrocketed. And it was like, yeah, because you have incredibly performant people. It's just that you're both speaking a different language. And I think we assume that when we speak English, for example, and that's why I always make the right is like we assume if we're speaking the same language as somebody,
Mm,
that the right information is coming across, and that's where
mm,
this ethnocentrism or like thinking that we all do the base things the exact same way,
mhm,
and cultural diversity is just layering on top of those bases. But when you realize that there is no base, and that kind of brings that second thing that I wanted to talk about, because I come across a lot of leaders who spend a lot of time trying to understand cultural differences, and I have a lot of admiration for the people who spend time doing that. The issue is that sometimes in trying to learn about how different cultures operate, these managers will start to operate around stereotypes instead, or generalizations.
mhm,
Um, and so I always remind people that it's important to look at intersectionality and this concept of somebody's experience of a culture will be very different depending on their gender, their religion, their socioeconomic status. Like there's so many, the environment that they're in, there's so many different things. And so I hear a lot of managers who are like, oh, for example, like I work all the time in Japan. And so I know that Japanese are like this. And I'll challenge them a little bit to say, well, yeah, but it depends. If they're in Tokyo, then they are probably going to be like that. But that's because it's more of an urban center. Whereas if you're going to a further out town where it's a little bit more rural, and they happen to be, from this type of religion, or they happen to be of this socioeconomic status, that's actually not at all how they're going to react to the situation. So yeah.
So that's such a good point. So Sam, if we get really practical, like what are some tips that a manager can use in a meeting with people who are from different backgrounds of any sort? It could be neurodiverse, it could be just someone who is different from them. So really kind of anyone. What are
Yeah.
some tips that we can offer them to help them not make these assumptions and like sort of verbalize what some of these unwritten rules are? Like, what are a few things, easy things to do that can save pain later on
Yeah. Yeah.
or misunderstanding at the
Yeah,
minimum?
100%. And potential trauma, because I mean that comes
Yeah.
from it's it might sound oversimplified, but for me it's know what you need first,
Okay.
and then just verbalize that.
So
Like
what does
it is
that mean? Like if,
so for example, like if I'm going to go into a meeting with a bunch of people, like let's say I'm hanging out with people at VFC and we're about to talk about something and maybe there's some new people on the team that I haven't met yet. It should be on me. My best practice, I'm not saying I do this. I need to get better at it. So you can hold me to it the next time I'm in a meeting with VFC. But is going in and saying, like, everybody, I'm Sam. Just a heads up, like I'm a very explicit communicator. So you might hear me repeat myself a few times. It's not because I don't trust any of you, or it's not because I think any of you are inept or whatever. It's just because culturally that's the kind of communication style that I have. I'm very I'm very linear when it comes to time. So if you find that I'm being a little bit too intense, or I'm not leaving enough room for questions, or I'm trying to wrap up the meeting and you have more things, it's not because I don't, want to make space for that. It's just because I have the habit of being very on time for things. And so just let me know, raise your hand if you want us to go over, if you think that I'm moving too quickly through things or whatever. So like those are two examples. So it's getting a sense of what are my needs culturally, being able to frame them from a cultural perspective to just say this is because otherwise when we hear somebody say this is what I need, that's when our accommodators in the room start to go and say, okay, well, they need this. So I'm just going to put my needs aside. Whereas if you just say culturally, this is what I'm used to, suddenly people sit there and they say, oh, okay, so then this person is open to maybe a different way of doing things. It's not core to their identity and who they are.
ah,
So I can bring, up an alternative way of doing things. I can maybe bring up my needs or my cultural way of doing things,
mm,
and it's not going to conflict. It's more just a discussion. So yeah, I would say go into the meeting
cool.
saying who you are. It gives those exact words. You can then go and say, oh, that's interesting that you're more explicit in your communication. I think I'm a bit more vague and nuanced. And now we know exactly where we stand. So if there's anything I need to clarify that you're saying, it's not because I didn't, you're not being clear as a communicator. I'm just a bit more explicit than you. So you might need to repeat yourself differently.
So maybe a prompt that could be when you go into a new work relationship, for example, I'm thinking of a manager with a new direct report. Maybe an opening exercise could be I tend to fill in the
Love it.
blanks. And both of you do that. And so it's like, one of the things I tell all of my direct reports is when I feel anxious, I tend to micromanage. We're both
Mm,
going to look out for that.
mm,
And we're going to try and call me to account when I do that. I think I'm getting better at it, and then I'll suddenly do it again.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I love that. It's like being really open. And I think the person with the power should go first and try and be as open as they can be. And then maybe over time, the direct report will get comfortable enough to explain their tendencies.
yeah,
If they ever do, they don't have to. But I
yeah,
think that's a really great first tip, is just being really open. And I love the prompt of not, I need this from you, or you're going to be a bad employee, which is the unwritten part. Which is what we've done in the past. What did we do? Trust. We had a prompt. It was like, what does trust mean to me? Which is
mm,
pretty heavy, because if
yeah.
I say trust means showing up on time, they're like, okay, better do that, or she's not going to
Here
trust
we
me and
go.
I'm not going to have a job. But it's this sort of culturally I'm used to. And I
Yes.
love that, because culturally I am used to, actually, I'm not used to the showing up on time. I suck at that. But it's,
Mm,
another one, for example,
yeah,
but that could be one. And then keeps that door open, as you said, which I think is so important. It keeps that door open to the person, challenging that and saying, okay,
yeah,
can we think about it?
yeah,
Culturally, I'm used to everyone using this project management software. Someone saying, yeah, that's not working for me. I'm not sure how, is there a way we can explore, something different for me? So
absolutely.
cool. I love that, Sam. Thank you so much. Okay, the next thing I wanted to ask you about is, you seem to be very multi-passionate as
Mhm.
a, I don't know if that's a real term or not, but I love that term. Um,
Amazing.
it's you just are a curious human, and this is partly why I love you so much. You just you'll jump into and kind of want to know about whatever is in front of you. And I think it's a beautiful thing. And I think that makes sense for your consulting company also, because you're always jumping into something new and trying to, that makes you really good at your job.
Yeah.
Um, but I think a question that a lot of people have when it comes to their own careers is, how do I choose which thing is the right thing to go after? What's the right thing for my career? What's the right thing for my personal brand?
Mm,
What's the right next thing for me to do? How fast should I be changing careers to look good on my resume, and all of these things?
yeah.
And you've done a lot of creative things in your life. And so I wondered if you could help kind of unpack some of those pressures that we feel for us in your experience.
I would love to, because it's a journey that I'm so grateful that I've been on, and I've had wonderful support around me, which is maybe like one of the keys
Mm,
to making it simpler as a process for me, or maybe less traumatizing. But it's funny because just this morning I gave this advice to my fiance, and if this is helpful for anybody listening around, it's never too late to start your career. He's 32 and he's just finishing school. Um, and so he's for the first time at his age kind of being like, I'm applying for different roles and I'm starting my career, and where do I like how do I know where the best place is to start or whatever. And I just looked at him and I was like, you'll know because you just pick something and you start. And then if 6 months later you realize, you know what, this wasn't really for me, then you can change that. And I think we're not told enough
mhm,
you can change your mind.
mm,
Um, I don't change my mind all the time, but it's one of those things that I happen to be expert at in a lot of aspects of my life, is just being like, this isn't working, so I'm gonna change. Um, so in terms of advice around like, yeah, how do you figure out what the best thing is for you, the career, like all of these kinds of things? I think what I've been learning, and it's been a very humbling journey, is that in the moment you don't know all of the different factors. So you can't possibly make the best decision for your career. So stop worrying about the best decision for your career and start worrying about the best decision for your next year or your
mm,
next 6 months. One thing that has helped me is being able to have like a bit of a life goal. And that means that whatever adventure I take on, or whatever jobs or clients, or, however my life transitions, as long as what I am doing aligns with that life goal, then I know I'm on the right track.
mm,
Um, does that make it difficult in a world of social media where everybody has an opinion? Yes.
mm,
I have now been off LinkedIn for 6 weeks, and it has been very healing for me. I
mm,
did not realize, how susceptible I was to a lot of what was going on, but I discovered that I compare myself a lot to people's careers, and so it's been nice in this transition to also take a step back. So that's another piece of advice, is like, if you're going through a transition, or if you're just feeling like really scattered and you don't know what the right thing is, try and take a step back from social media. It will be there when you get back. Like, I used to be terrified of stopping writing on LinkedIn because if I stopped, I'd lose everybody and my whole network would disappear. And I've discovered that no, firstly, it's cool because you see the people who still reach out, even though they haven't seen you posting, means that, you know who the real ones are. Um,
Mm,
but it gives you a chance to get some clarity. There are so many possibilities these days. And I think social media is great for a lot of things, but it's also really good at confusing us and kind of sending us in different directions. So yeah, if you're feeling a little bit scattered, I would take a step back from social media and just sit there and say, like, what feels exciting to me right now?
yeah.
And that's, what I did with this transition to being a flight attendant was I was doing consulting. I was transitioning from doing HR consulting to cultural consulting. The clients, the client base, the client need, the appetite just was not the same. And so I try to be very transparent about that as well to say, because I think we see a lot of people who have their businesses or consultants and it looks like they're just perpetually doing really, really well. But I got to a point where I was just like, this is not generating revenue for me right now. I don't want to keep doing HR. I want to transition. So I need something that can generate revenue for me while I continue to work on this passion of mine, which is my business right now.
Mm,
So that's where the initial decision to do flight attendant came from, was really just, I need to pay my rent. And I
mm,
think that needs to be normalized too. Like
yeah.
contributing, like growing a successful career and surviving in capitalism are two very different. And we need to call that out more and more. So for me, the decision was like, I need to survive in capitalism so that I can grow my career. So first, I'm going to find a way to make some money. The flight attendant thing was initially just, it was a flexible schedule. It allowed me to travel. Like it ticked a lot of those boxes.
Mm,
Um, and then Air Inuit was really by happenstance, where LinkedIn noticed that I was applying to some flight attendant roles and they were like, oh, Air Inuit's hiring. I didn't even know that they were an airline that existed in Canada. And then I joked with some friends. I was like, I'm going to apply. We'll see what happens. And now all of a sudden I'm being a flight attendant by myself on airplanes going up north. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind, but I took the chance and I said, we'll see. I think being able to say that to yourself is like, we'll see what happens. If it's not for me, I'll stop the training. Okay. It's really not the end of the world.
yeah, that's right. I love that. So, okay, so I heard a couple of things. One is you can change your mind.
Yes.
One is life goal or intention and figuring out what that is. That's a whole other podcast because how does one create that and how do you know what it is? But I love that as a tip. Stepping away from social media to provide clarity and kind of release what I'm hearing is release a little bit of the outside in pressure. Because I think sometimes we go to social media for inspiration, right? It's like, okay, who's doing this and in what way? But I hear you when it can get really loud and it can also feed on our insecurities. And then what feels exciting. That's a
Mhm.
big one that I follow is what feels inspiring because I have a very difficult time doing anything if I'm not inspired. So I have lots of tricks for getting me inspired. It doesn't take much because I'm similar to you. I'm very curious, but there's like little tips I have for getting inspired. Like, for example, I will Google something that's around the same thing. So, say I need to start an innovation process for a project. I'll kind of start looking at other companies that have done incredible innovation things, and then as soon as it's like almost like I have to take a step off the ledge into the topic. Then
Yeah.
I'm diving like I can't help it. And
Yes.
so that's just like a trick I use because if I just wait around, I'm not going to just get inspired on my own. So I love that what feels exciting because I don't know if you're a single purpose person, I don't think this is a problem. And so this isn't really who we're not talking to those people, but we're talking to the people for whom that's not the case. We're like interested in a lot of different things. And my career has taken me in a bunch of different directions as well. And so, yeah, what feels exciting and this after watching the show Flight Attendant, I definitely understand. I watched
Right?
that and I was like, this looks really fun.
Yeah.
But I just think also it's fun how you're applying your anthropology expertise to this new career also. And it feels like you're using it a little bit as a inquiry research space almost as like what is this and what is this? Oh, and also Sam, the idea that I wanted to explore with you is um, you talked about the perception that you're taking a step back in your career. That was
Mhm.
something that you were afraid of at first
Yeah.
because we rank jobs as being cool and important and shiny and sexy and jobs that are not. And maybe could you talk to me a little bit about how you got past that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because I'm still, I think, going through it sometimes, and I have to, pull my pants up sometimes when I'll talk
Mm,
to somebody from my network who I haven't spoken to in a while, and I'm like, "Oh, well, my schedule's a little bit all over the place because I'm a flight attendant." Some reactions are positive, others are a little bit confused. And I automatically want to jump into justifying my decision. And then I just have to take a beat and say, no, I don't, if they're curious and they want to ask questions, that's great, but I don't have to justify myself.
Yeah.
The biggest thing was looking and saying like, and maybe it's a little bit, I don't know, like in the spiritual realm or whatever, but it's like we have like 70 to 80 solid years of life. Like anything beyond that for me is a cherry on top of the sundae. And a portion of that 70 to 80 years, maybe let's say the first 18, 19, maybe 20, are you're being guided by your family, you're working through generational trauma. Like there's like a lot of stuff before you get to then a point where you're like, okay, I have a sense of what my identity is. And now I'm starting to live. So like we'll reduce that to maybe 50 or 60 years of like solid living. Like that goes by so fast. And for me, it just and somebody I don't know if I read this on Pinterest. Pinterest inspires me all the time.
Yeah.
The algorithm knows what I need to hear. But it was something around in order to make a transition, status quo needs to be more painful than the transition itself. And that's where I got to in my decision to go in was just like the idea of living my life for social media, the idea of living and doing my career for the sake of, making as much money as I can and just really just for the bragging rights to say I never gave up on my business versus the fear of missing out on so many different opportunities.
Mm.
Suddenly that like one out started to outweigh the other and the balance shifted. And so I just sat there and I was like, I have one life that I have to live and it's going by like before my eyes. And so I just want to go out and live it. And so obviously, again, there's that aspect of I can't just quit my job and go spend a year traveling and doing all of those kinds of things. So what is a way that I can maintain my lifestyle, reduce it? Like I had to do that in certain areas. So I can keep paying rent, keep buying groceries, those types of things. But I can go out and try new things.
Mm.
Um, and I don't see, and it's very cultural. Most, especially in the Western hemisphere, um, this idea of trying new things is kind of like we're a lot more risk averse.
Mm.
And career becomes a lot more of this ultimate goal. Uh,
Mm.
but I love that there in a lot of other cultures, like this idea of retirement, right? Like there are so many cultures where people are living until their hundreds, and when you ask them what their secret is, they're like, I never stopped working, but the work that I do, I really, really love. And that
Mm.
work could have changed hundreds of times throughout their entire life. But they weren't just saying, I'm going to be miserable for a certain amount of time. I'm going to build my career. I'm going to get to a point where I have enough money and then I'm going to retire. We're seeing, I mean, like what's happening in Los Angeles, it's incredibly tragic. But
Mm.
it's people who have, you spend all of this time to try and accumulate this type of wealth. And what we're seeing is material things, they disappear just as quickly. With the pandemic, we saw this as well, right? You can have all these hopes and dreams about what your life is going to look like, and those can all come crashing down because a virus doesn't care what your ambition is.
Mm.
So for me, it's being able to put a lot of those things in perspective to say there's a lot of stuff out of my control.
Mm.
What is in my control is being able to make the most of every single day,
Mm.
make sure that it's things that feel authentic to me, while still paying my bills. Like I feel like a lot of times you'll hear the rhetoric of like, go after things that excite you. And a lot of people are like, yeah, except in inflation. And also
Yeah.
like, I need to pay my rent. And so it
Right.
like
Right.
sounds really nice, but that's not realistic.
Right.
So for me, it was finding a compromise. ChatGPT is very helpful for that. I use
Great
ChatGPT
tip.
with my therapist sometimes to be like, here are all the things I love doing. What are some jobs I would have never considered? Or what are some, are there companies that are hiring for those specific roles? What do I need to be able to get them? Like whatever.
Yeah.
That can be a helpful tool too.
Yeah. I love that. It's a very interesting way to think about sort of the life goal you talked about, or maybe one other question we can ask ourselves is, what does wealth mean to us? And I've heard you talk about that before. Wealthy doesn't necessarily mean accumulation of goods, material goods, and it can mean that. That's part of it. That's fun.
Yeah.
And it can be necessary. It can also be like I think probably talking above the basic needs that we have. After those are met, then what? And
Yeah.
it's what would it feel like to have a fully abundant life, be able to look back on our lives and say, okay, that was a rich life. And that feels like what you're doing. It feels like you're looking back almost and thinking, okay, I want to be able to have traveled a lot more than I already have. And I want to continue to travel and explore other cultures. Of course, that would be interesting for you. And so what are the practical pieces that can make that happen? And so, it all kind of actually is very logical when you think about it like that, your
Yeah, it
decisions.
is. It
Mm.
is. Like, I think a lot of times we can have like what some people maybe call it career ADD, or, where you're just like, oh, I want to try this, and I want to try this, and I want to try this. But yeah, I think when you start to look back, you realize that you do in your heart know where you're headed. And anytime I've looked back at any of the changes I've made, I've realized, oh, well, they all kind of aligned in some way, like they were
Hmm.
all just branches of the exact same path.
Hmm.
Did I get to the end of, or I'm like, am I getting to my destination a little bit more slowly because I'm taking all of these detours? Maybe, yeah. Like if I started my career in my 20s and I just stayed at the same business or in the same role, I'd probably be a director or VP at this point, and it, like I'd be singing all the way to the bank. Um, and maybe that works for some people, but I think, yeah, so if you're finding that you're really scattered and you're kind of all over the place, maybe give yourself some credit that there is actually a little bit more reason to the madness,
Yeah.
than you think. And that's where I
Hmm.
think the social media comes in, because oftentimes, I mean, the algorithm is designed to feed us there's one way, right? It's like it shows us like, oh, you like this kind of stuff, we're just going to keep showing you the same thing. And so we're not conditioned to understand that you can still end up at the same destination by taking 600 different detours and
Hmm.
trying 600 different passions, and
Hmm.
just experimenting. And
Yeah.
also, if you enjoy it enough, you can um you can be successful in it.
Hmm.
You want
Yeah.
to be a potter and you are absolutely passionate about making pottery. I have friends who, like that's how they make their living, and going to little markets and those kind, like, I think if you really, really are passionate and excited about it, there's a way to make it work.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Obviously,
agree.
not counting systemic, like there's a lot of systemic oppression and those types of things that get in your way, but it starts with the self-belief.
I agree. I agree. Well, one of my best friends from growing up is a potter, and she is the same.
Mm,
She's had to make sacrifices, I guess one would say, or she's had to adjust things in her life in order to accommodate that. But it's worth it because of the joy she gets from that lifestyle. So, yeah, I think it's just such a fascinating thing to explore, and I really appreciate you going there with us, Sam. Um, I want to wish you all the best with all of the careers that you have going on right now. I'm definitely really proud of you for your most recent journey because it just feels really authentic, and it feels like uh, something that a lot of people do. There's actually your dad posted about your recent career, and I was reading a comment yesterday, and people were talking about the different types of careers where people have to do this, where it's very normal. And
yeah.
I can't remember what this one guy
It
was
was
talking about. Yeah. And then what did he say? Which career? What did he say?
talking about farming and how a lot of farmers,
Farming.
because
And
yeah,
I was thinking creatives, like my friends who are
yeah,
musicians, like they all have day jobs. Is that their passion? Maybe, but maybe not. So it's very normal in a lot of types of work. A lot of people live this way. And so the
yeah,
idea that people don't, and
mhm,
it's like that's just one way. It's just one algorithm.
100%.
And so I think it's beautiful, and beautiful that you've been really open with us about it, and with the world about it. Um, so thanks for being here, Sam. Thanks for being a really good friend of VFC. And I wish you all the best, and I hope I get to see you soon.
Yes, thanks, Gina. Thanks for the chat. I appreciated it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.